begins, quite appropriately, with soup, or more precisely, with something that would very much like to be soup, if only it had a bit more ambition and perhaps fewer medieval pigeons floating suspiciously within it. You see, the people of medieval Europe had a deeply committed relationship to things being boiled in pots. So committed, in fact, that some of these pots remained on the fire for decades. Not days, not weeks, decades. Imagine a stew pot gently simmering on a hearth fire, never empty, forever receiving ingredients as they became available. A carrot here, a duck foot there, a ladle of yesterday's rabbit. This concoction was known as perpetual stew, and it was less of a recipe and more of a lifestyle choice. A medieval simmer that never truly ended, so much as evolved. In medieval inns and households alike, this perpetual pot was the culinary equivalent of a communal diary. It remembered everything, every onion, every regrettable beat. Guests arrived tired and travel-worn, removed their mud-encrusted shoes, splashed their faces with icy water from a bucket of questionable hygiene, and then were offered a humble bowl of story-rich mush from the eternal stew. It was warm, filling, and alarmingly familiar. Fast forward to today, and in the flickering light of a late-night kebab shop, you might recognize a distant relative, the ever-turning donor, shaved endlessly from its sizzled haunch. Or perhaps you've seen the same pot of chicken soup in your office breakroom kitchen, mysteriously replenished, but never quite consumed. These are the echoes of the perpetual stew, quiet, ladled remnants of our ancestors' defiant refusal to start from scratch. But the stew was only the first spoonful of strangeness. Let us now nibble at something slightly odd and shaped like a corner. Trenchers. Not the soldiers, the bread. Medieval folk, clever in ways both practical and alarming, didn't believe in plates. Why dirty a fine ceramic dish, they thought, when one could simply eat the bowl? And so they served stews and meats atop slabs of stale bread, called trenchers. Tough, chewy, and thoroughly soaked by the end of a meal, they were either eaten, fed to dogs, or, in particularly pious establishments, given to the poor, which is sweet, until you consider the state of the bread after sitting under 4 fatty sausages, an entire boiled onion, and a heap of something described only as yesterday's fish. Today, though, the trencher lives on in every edible taco bowl or sourdough bread bowl filled with chili at a hip gastropub. We nod along, sipping IPA, barely aware we're partaking in what was once considered a disposable plate in 1382. Even the rituals that didn't involve eating, not directly at least, quietly lounged beside our current habits. Before any food touched one's mouth, medieval diners, at least the fancy ones, observed a curious pre-meal performance. A basin of water would be brought forth, scented if you were lucky, cloudy if you weren't. A servant offered the bowl, and one by one guests delicately dabbed their fingers and dried them on pieces of cloth without getting up. This was not out of elegance, but necessity. One ate with one's fingers, and those fingers were often expressing deep familiarity with livestock. Fast forward again, and the echo of this survives. A warm, lemon-scented towel on a sushi tray. A moist towelette lurking at the bottom of a barbecue box. The ritual of hand-washing before meals, once rooted in survival, now masquerades as refinement. It is strange what we carry forward. Perhaps stranger still is the persistence of the first breakfast. In medieval times, breakfast wasn't ever guaranteed. For the peasantry, eating before noon was often considered suspiciously indulgent. But for the hard labouring, especially during harvest, a small meal upon rising, often ale-soaked bread, cheese, and the ever-present onion staved off dizziness from morning toil. Today, the notion of hobbits enjoying second breakfast may feel adorable and fictional, but first breakfast, modest and practical, endures in our quick slices of toast, oat bars, and anxious sips of coffee in sleepy kitchens. So the next time you stare at your early morning granola and wonder what it's all really for, remember, somewhere in 1298, a man named Ethelbert was chewing an onion at dawn, and he felt exactly the same way. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Close your eyes. We're just getting warmed up, like a good stew. Imagine a table, not just any table. A table hewn from rough oak boards, shaped by hand, and polished with a rag soaked in beeswax and possibly a bit of ale, because, well, that's what they had. On this table sits a single enormous hunk of dark bread, hardened by air and time to the consistency of roof tile. This, dear listener, was the heart of your medieval dinnerware, the trencher. Now, in the unlikely event you've never eaten your stew off a chunk of stale bread, allow me to gently introduce you to this charming, but somewhat suspicious, dining custom. In medieval Europe, particularly around the 13th century and beyond, plates as we imagined them weren't quite in fashion. Ceramics were relatively expensive, and not everyone could just waltz into medieval IKEA and pick up a dinner set. So instead, enterprising peasants and noblefolk alike reached for the nearest loaf of bread and thought, yes, that'll do. These trenchers, slices of thick old bread, usually days old and nearly indestructible, were used as edible serving plates. Upon these stoic slabs of carb, people would ladle their meats, their stews, their lentils, and whatever else the kitchen produced, often vividly brown or greyish in nature. The trencher would absorb the juices, soften ever so slightly, and transform from bread plate into bread pudding in the course of a single meal. Now, before you decide medieval folks were simply too lazy to wash porcelain, consider the ingenuity here. In a world without dishwashers and limited access to running water, unless you counted that trickling stream where the local goose performed its daily business, reusing food as crockery was, well, rather environmentally forward. Imagine finishing dinner and just eating your plate. That's zero waste, peasant style. That said, not everyone tucked into their trencher with gusto. In wealthier households, the grease-soaked bread slabs were often donated to the poor or delightfully thrown to the dogs, who must have spent most of their lives praying for gravy. Charity, in this context, was often lukewarm and meat-flavoured. There's something quite sweet about the idea of feasting with others around a long table, everyone stabbing at meats across a shared hunk of bread that once served as both plate and by the end dessert. It was communal, if slightly soggy. Utensils were scarce, so fingers were encouraged. Napkins? You had sleeves, or a good lick. And yet, fragments of this peculiar bread as tableware habit trickled quietly down the stream of time. Not the part about licking trenchers, thank heavens, but the broader idea of edible or temporary vessels still lingers. Consider the humble taco, the wrap, the ice cream cone, even the fast food hamburger nestled in a bun you grip with bare hands. An echo, perhaps, of the old trencher tradition. The bread still catching the juices, still sacrificing itself nobly for our convenience. Then, of course, there's the phrase breaking bread with someone. A gesture of friendship and peace that harks all the way back to when bread wasn't just food, but the literal foundation of the meal. Still today, sharing bread remains a timeless, comforting ritual. Though mercifully, we've upgraded our trenchers to ciabattas and baguettes, and no longer pour sheep stew directly on top. Usually, and while few today would regard a 2-day-old loaf as an adequate plate, it's worth noting that sourdough bowls and bread boats served at hip cafes are really just trenchers in trendy disguise. A clear case of history managing to sneak back into the dining room wearing artisan boots and a rustic aesthetic. So the next time you tear off a crusty edge of bread to sop up stew, or dare to dip your grilled cheese into tomato soup, congratulate yourself. You're preserving a fine tradition. You're eating like a medieval baron, minus the plagues, the lice, and the absence of central heating. Now, as our dream ship sails gently past the oaken table, past the flickering torchlight, and into the more aromatic corners of medieval kitchens, we drift towards something uniquely puzzling. Why in heaven's name did people put spices that cost more than a cow onto boiled turnips? Once upon a table not too dissimilar from your own, though perhaps a bit wobblier, and certainly covered in more beeswax, people of the medieval world gathered, not with forks and knives held proudly in both hands, but instead with something far humbler. The trencher. Yes, the trencher. A fine example of culinary multitasking and medieval pragmatism. In its earliest incarnation, a trencher wasn't a wooden platter or a pewter plate. It was bread, stale bread, rock-resistant bread. Bread so firm and stoic, it could serve as both plate and punishment, should a knight become unruly and need reminding of his table manners. Each diner received a thick hunk of this day-old delight, usually cut into a square, sturdy enough to hold heaps of steaming whatever the stew is today. It served partly as a serving implement and partly as dinner's final act. When the meal was done, one could gnaw on the gravy-soaked slab, or, if of nobler breeding, toss it to the nearest servant, beggar, or wandering livestock. It was heavily implied, though never outright stated, that hungry dogs and grateful peasants were preferred patrons for second-hand bread. Now, here's the quiet twist. Even now, you, dear sleepy listener, might be using a trencher, though you probably call it toast. While the medieval act of eating one's plate has faded from memory, the sentiment perches warm and golden brown on your breakfast table. Avocado toast, a fancy trencher, peanut butter and jelly, a VHS-era trencher sweetened for overtime cartoons. Centuries pass, but the instinct to stack food on bread persists, like a culinary ghost peeking from under the table. And imagine the dinner conversations back then, between bites of pottage and friendly slaps on the back, keeping in mind table sharing was a contact sport in itself. There was always the peripheral threat of that trencher soaking through. A particularly juicy roast could seep down into the bread, softening it just enough to give way mid-sentence. Nothing frays a feasting mood like watching your chicken leg disappear through a soggy slab and tumble into the hay. It was a time before personal space and individual plates. Meals were communal, often taken from shared bowls and mugs, which explains why medieval folk were so liberal with their spice usage. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, things we now hoard for December baking and seasonal lattes, were used with unrelenting enthusiasm, both for flavour and for covering up meat that had been aged slightly past its social grace. Let's just say refrigeration hadn't yet staged its chilly revolution. But we digress. The transition from edible trencher to inedible plate came slowly, as many revolutions do, with wood. Wooden trenchers emerged as the middle-class answer to having soggy sleeves and unpredictable bread surfaces. These could be reused, scrubbed, sort of, and passed down for generations, or at least until someone mistook them for firewood. The irony here is rich. Medievals stopped eating their plates and started growing forests of dishes instead. Still, in a dreamy way, this edible functional philosophy lingers. Modern chefs reinvent the concept with bread bowls for soup, served proudly to Instagrammers everywhere. And pizza, that ancient Mediterranean marvel, carries on the torch. Toppings on bread, no plate required, all eaten by hand. The old ways, boxed with cheese. Even Michelin star menus have toyed with edible vessels. Some offer smoked salmon on puff pastry plates, or desserts assembled on crisp sugar tuiles. No one calls it a trencher, of course, because courier of cuisine sounds better than hard bread that won't collapse under goose grease. But the spirit remains. People are endlessly delighted by the idea that their food can carry itself and deliver a little crunch on the way down. So the trencher, humble, enduring, and quietly revolutionary, earned its place in the great hall of half-forgotten customs. In every bite of toast, every hollowed bread bowl filled with bisque, there echoes the dining table of a medieval manor, somewhere between the flicker of candlelight and the distant sound of a lute being enthusiastically plucked. And just as the trencher gave way to new inventions, another peculiarity patiently waited its turn to shine. Not what they ate from, but how they ate it. With hands, spoons, fingers, and something altogether hard to define. Let's slip gently into that next little curiosity, shall we? As twilight settled over the mossy roofs of a forgotten medieval hamlet, perhaps called something charmingly inefficient like Swinesher Underwog, the villagers gathered for supper. Supper, of course, being the kind of meal that looked suspiciously like lunch, but with slightly more candlelight and disagreement. Now, before folk strutted onto the culinary runway, Europe was ruled by the tyranny of hands. Yes, clean or not, fingers were the original cutlery. Knives were common, sure, but they were fiercely personal. Much like bringing your own yoga mat to a class, bringing your own knife to dinner was not only appropriate, it was expected. Declining to bring one might raise eyebrows and perhaps suspicions about your upbringing or general usefulness. But here's the peculiar part. Though they had knives, and some of them rather fancy, they rarely used them to eat directly with. Instead, one would stab a morsel, hoist it solemnly to the lips, and transfer it via teeth, like a particularly edible joust. And those without knives, they might borrow one from a neighbor if they were blessed with charm, or simply rely more heavily on bread. Ah yes, bread, the unacknowledged plate of the medieval era. Not content to merely feed a hungry crowd, bread played an architectural role in dining before it was ever enjoyed. This was the trencher system. Imagine a thick, crusty slab of yeasty dough, usually a few days old, and designed less for delight and more for structural integrity. Your stew, your roast, your mystery meat medley, all were ladled atop this edible foundation. The juices soaked in, the gravy puddled like warm dreams. And once the meal had marinated the bread into something half sandwich, half sponge, voila. Another course. While wealthier folk often discarded their used trenchers, sometimes to the poor or to dogs, or to philosophical discussions on waste, many others relished them as dessert. Because what's better than ending your meal than with gravy-flavoured bread pudding that requires no baking? And speaking of sharing things that shouldn't be shared, cast your sleepy mind to the communal drinking cup, also known as that wooden goblet everybody used. At feasts and even humble meals, a single, generous vessel might circle the table, kissed by one cracked-lipped peasant after another, like it was collecting medieval DNA for future historians. Now, hygiene, at least in the way we imagine it, was more of a rumor than a practice. They had beliefs, of course. Bathing too much could cause illness, they believed, presumably because the clean folk kept dying anyway. But cleanliness at table was a performance. Guests would be offered a bowl of water to rinse their hands before eating, particularly if they weren't wearing gloves. And yes, gloves at the table were perfectly fine, as long as they weren't so new as to mark you as unbearably rich, nor so patched that a turnip would judge you. Of course, manners were very important. One did not stick one's knife into the salt or blow on a spoon. One certainly did not gnaw both ends of a cheese at once. If you passed gas, you did so loudly to assert your dominance, or so the etiquette books don't say, but might have been quietly understood. But the real symphony of the table was not in the recipes, it was in observation. Medieval diners didn't have cookbooks with artistic photos. They had mouths and they had eyes. They watched what the noble across the table was doing. They peered into bowls with subtle longing, and they imitated the behavior of someone who looked like they had successfully eaten yesterday. Such traditions linger. Consider the enduring habit of breaking bread before a meal, left over from the days when entire loaves functioned as dinnerware. Or the phrase, "bring a knife and fork," which has roots in an era when bringing your own knife was both practical and socially correct. And don't get me started on dipping bread into soup like it's the height of innovation. We've been doing that since the soup was invented, and bread was considered a sponge with edges. So next time you marvel at dipping a crusty heel into your tomato bisque, consider that you're participating in a practice older than half the castles still standing. You, dear listener, are the heir to the trencher tradition, albeit with possibly fewer fleas. And as the table quiets, the candle gutters, and the communal goblet makes its final round, we begin to notice that not everything on the plate is what it seems. Some dishes were more about signaling than taste, and some ingredients, well, were simply there to test the limits of what could be considered food. But that, as the flickering lamplight suggests with a conspiratorial wink, is a story best served next. As night settled across damp, straw-covered halls of stone, and oil lamps threw flickering shadows on rough-hewn oak tables, a curious hush often fell over medieval feasting chambers, not because of reverence, but because, quite simply, people were concentrating very hard on eating without forks. You see, our modern meals, involving an elegant parade of specialized utensils, polite bites, and individual plates, are descendants, through several charmingly chaotic centuries, of a dining system that strongly discouraged anything resembling personal space, or hygiene. In the high medieval period, most folks didn't have forks, not because they hadn't been invented, they had, and the Byzantines were happily pronging away centuries earlier, but because the Europeans, particularly those in the West, suspected forks of devilry, 2, sometimes 3 tines poking food like tiny pitchforks. Suspicious. Best to keep the devil out of dinner. Instead, meals were a team sport. Bread took center stage, not just as a side, mind you, but as an edible plate. Trenchers, they were called. Hefty slabs of stale bread cut thick enough to soak up sauces and support meat. If you were a noble, you might not eat the trencher at all. It would, after absorbing the gravies and drippings of your roast beast, be donated to the poor. This sounds charitable, until you realize the trenchers were often covered in more fingers than a medieval lute. Still, beggars can't be choosers. Literally. Knives were another matter. Most people carried their own, at the utility tool used for everything from carving meat to trimming fingernails, with perhaps a dabble in small disputes. You would bring it to the table, slice yourself a portion of whatever glistening roast or pottage was passed your way, and deftly transfer it to your deeply flattering lower lip sans fork. Occasionally, you shared a knife, somewhat like sharing a toothbrush, but with more mutton. And then there was the matter of hands. 2 hands, 1 meal, endless chaos. You see, eating with your hands wasn't the mindless, casual activity of modern times. Oh no, it was ritualistic, studied, and investigated by proper scholars of the forkless age. There were rules. Etiquette manuals went into extraordinary detail about how much of which fingers could enter your mouth without social ruin. Thumb and 2 fingers were acceptable. Whole hand eating was base and uncouth. And always, always wash your hands before a feast. Ideally in rosewater, brought in by a servant with a bowl of scented water and a linen towel, offering you a refresh before you plunge those fingers into the communal stew. Communal, yes. That was the key word. Nothing was yours alone at mealtime. Most food was shared. Meat dishes, pies, stews, even sauces were spooned or fingered from a central platter, with whatever grace your status or sleeves allowed. The word mess, as in a mess of pottage, referred not only to the food itself, but to the group you dined with, appropriately titled. This custom slowly simmered down, but didn't entirely vanish. If you've ever attended a dinner party where someone says, "Just dig in," over a shared charcuterie board while swiping prosciutto with their fingers, you are witnessing an echo of ancient trenchers and communal meat. Or if you've ever seen people argue over the double dipping of a chip, well, that medieval mess lives on. Eventually, the fork, a distrusted foreign implement at first, gained popularity through sheer persistence, fashion, and occasional royal whims. Catherine de' Medici, homesick in France after leaving Italy, brought forks to her new court in the 16th century. From there, forks trickled into the habits of nobility, then down to the merchant class, until finally, centuries later, they became commonplace, and then immediately lost under furniture. But even now, there's something primal left in us. At the heart of every buffet line, summer barbecue, and late-night snack with sticky fingers, lives the spirit of the Middle Ages, alive and true, and just a little sauce-stained. And as the evening candle sputters low, let us drift forward to another curious culinary quirk, not in what they ate, but when. In the quiet shuffle of daily life today, there exists a ritual so routine, so seemingly unimpressive, that it's easy to overlook the fact that you are, quite possibly, reenacting a 700-year-old cultural performance without even knowing it. I'm speaking, of course, about the humble napkin. Ah yes, the napkin. Modern civilization's silent dining companion. But in the 13th century, it had not yet taken its handy square-shaped form. One did not daintily dab the corner of one's lips with a folded linen square while sipping barley soup beside a roaring hearth. No, in the early Middle Ages, people used something far more comprehensive. Their shirt. Indeed, in medieval Europe, before the napkin was honoured with its own cutlery drawer, diners regularly used the sleeve of their tunic, or the tunic of their neighbour, to clean greasy fingers and errant gravy splashes. It was a time when sauce happened, and you just sort of had to live with it. Washing machines had not yet entered the feast. At feasts, long communal tables would bow beneath the weight of trenchers and roasted mystery meats, and every now and then, someone would nonchalantly lean over and use the tablecloth itself as a makeshift facial cleanser. This was not considered particularly rude, It was, after all, a cloth on a table. What else was it for? Eventually, someone, perhaps a laundry servant with one too many meaty tunics in their wash pile, had the revolutionary idea of assigning each person their own personal scrap of cloth. It was like inventing the wheel, but for table etiquette. The napkin had arrived. Napkins in early form were more like miniature towels than modern serviettes. They were occasionally the size of a scarf and doubled, for some nobles, as fashion statements. In the 14th century French court, for example, men might wear their napkins slung rakishly over one shoulder during a banquet, as if to say, "I'm about to eat an entire pheasant, but elegantly." In humbler homes, however, the options for facial maintenance remained limited. The table napkin, as we think of it today, was still considered a luxury, and a deeply unnecessary one to those who felt perfectly comfortable wiping their hands on their own trousers. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when forks emerged from the shadows of suspicion and people began thinking, maybe I don't have to touch my food with my entire hand, that fine napkin etiquette began to blossom. With an implement between you and your stew, your sleeve could breathe a sigh of relief. Napkin folding then became an art form all its own. In the courts of 16th century Italy and Germany, elaborate folds shaped into fans, animals, or abstract statements of wealth would be arranged at each place setting. There was a period, delightfully brief, when some upper crust feasts featured napkins folded into full-size swans, perched and glaring disapprovingly at your goblet of mead. Imagine being judged by a linen bird while eating porridge. What's even more enchanting, and just absurd enough, is that medieval etiquette guides instructed guests not only on when and how to use their napkins, but where to place them when not in use. Draped over the left shoulder, across the lap, or in certain cases, back onto the table as a sort of edible bookmark. One 15th century handbook recommends gently pressing the napkin to your lips before speaking, giving one the appearance of a contemplative, bread-loving intellectual. Today, as napkins come pre-folded alongside our airport sandwiches or wrapped tightly around pairs of plastic utensils in the local diner, we rarely consider their curious, gravy-smeared ancestry. But a glance in the mirror after pizza night reveals a smeared coincidence: the front of your shirt, proudly continuing centuries of tradition. So tonight, if your dream takes you to a forest banquet lit by candlelight and echoing with lute music, beware the roast dripping with mystery juices. And should you find no linen swan in sight, remember the wisdom of those who came before. When in doubt, find a sleeve, your own or otherwise. Now, let's drift deeper still into the soothing, slumber-sprinkled past, where meals weren't meals, without a little touch of chaos, and where even salt had secrets no one quite expected. In the gentle golden hush of twilight dining, there lies a secret more curious than any medieval feast. People all across Europe once shared a single drinking vessel at the dinner table and thought very little of it. Yes, long before the era of water glasses shaped like tulips and refillable soda cups the size of small buckets, there was the communal cup, an age-old relic of both practicality and questionable hygiene. This was not done out of some quaint cultural ritual, though it certainly had its ceremonial charm. No, in the medieval household, the standing cup was often the lone goblet in service, a handsome beaker made from pewter, silver, or carved horn, passed solemnly from hand to hand like the most hydrated game of medieval hot potato. And if you were the youngest at the table, or worse, a guest of lower status, you always drank last. Lucky you. There was, despite the rather democratic appearance, a hierarchy encoded in this humble act. The lord of the manor might lift the cup first with a kind of Shakespearean flourish, nod thoughtfully into the void, and take a drink that everyone else watched as though it were a royal decree. From there the cup made its rounds, a moist, glistening bronze baton, in an unspoken relay of bonded saliva and feudal loyalty. Why, you might ask with modern incredulity, didn't they just use individual glasses? Well, dear listener, the washing up fairy had yet to be invented, and soap was better known for warding off evil spirits than removing soup stains. Owning multiple cups was a luxury, and even if you had them, washing each one was akin to preparing for knighthood. The process was long, the results unpredictable, and someone probably got wet along the way. Strangely, echoes of this medieval sipping tradition whisper to us still. Ever find yourself at a rustic wedding where someone insists you all toast from a horn or a metal chalice for tradition, or watch as a fancy whiskey gets slowly passed around at some unusually enthusiastic dinner party? That's not just hospitality. That's the spirit of Geoffrey the cupbearer whispering into your ear, offering you both history and backwash. In grander homes, or at least grander than the average hay and smoke cottage, there might be more than one cup, perhaps even a curious type known as the mazer. Mazers were wooden bowls, often rimmed in silver, designed specifically for drinking. Practical, yes, but also prone to swelling, cracking, or, occasionally, hosting a family of beetles. Still, if you received your cider in a mazer, chances were you were ranking somewhere above pig boy in the household pecking order. A real honor, honestly. Of course, the use of shared utensils went hand in jam-covered hand with another charming quirk. Dipping food right into communal pots and saucers. Guests would reach toward a central bowl of pottage, thick, unidentifiable stew, snatch a dripping morsel with bread or fingers, and think not at all of germs, but only of whether someone else had beaten them to the last turnip. Monastic refectories and noble halls alike echoed with the contented sounds of shared spoons and the occasional slow-motion game of gravy splash roulette. And yet, while the hygiene standards may raise modern brows, and possibly eyebrows if those brows had faces, there was something deeply bonding about it all. To drink from the same cup was an act of trust. To dip into the same broth with another man's bread chunk floating nearby. That was practically a marriage proposal. As humbler houses became more prosperous and glassware more affordable, thank you, Renaissance capitalism, the communal cup began to fade into memory, preserved only in ceremonial toasts and confusing bachelor party traditions. By the 18th century, individual glasses at meals became not only possible, but fashionable. Another little civilized miracle, like using forks or washing your hands before touching cheese. Still, the echoes remain. Every time a bottle of wine is passed from friend to friend with nods more solemn than necessary, or a single shared dessert spoon is awkwardly offered across a booth at a late-night diner, that ancient impulse stirs. We all, it seems, seek a kind of closeness, only managed by putting our lips where a dozen others have gone before, possibly for better, often for worse, and always with an aftertaste of history. As night deepens and the goblet is passed into dreams, let us draw our gaze toward one of the more quietly peculiar traditions born around that same long oaken table. A tradition with mystery baked right in. In the dusky glow of candlelight, where shadows danced like shy jesters on the stone walls of manor kitchens, there lay a truly understated relic of medieval ingenuity: trenchers. not the deep-digging kind wielded in muddy fields by weary serfs, though let's take a moment to appreciate their efforts, but rather bread trenchers. These humble, edible plates served up every course with a quiet, crusty charm, and while they were eventually exiled from British dining tables, their ghost still haunts our modern food habits. Imagine, if you will, your dinner plate as a loaf of yesterday's bread, sliced and slightly stale. That's not a Pinterest mishap or an experimental sourdough phase 3. It's how food was served for the better part of the Middle Ages. The idea was beautifully economical. What better way to avoid washing up than to eat the plate itself? Medieval trenchers were typically made from coarse, thick slabs of brown bread, several inches wide, enough to reliably cradle your daily serving of pottage or roasted goose without buckling under the pressure. They weren't exactly ergonomic. In fact, you could sprain a wrist lifting one loaded with mutton, turnips, and questionable stew. But they did the job, absorbing grease and fortifying stomachs. More interesting still was the fate of the trencher after the meal. Some diners devoured their bread plate, soaking up every last drop of gravy as a sort of carb-laden encore. Others, concerned with maintaining a pious image or wearing tight tunics, donated their used trenchers to the poor. A medieval win-win. You avoided gluttony, and someone else got a slightly mushy surprise. But here's the twist. This archaic edible plate didn't vanish altogether. It ducked into the corner of collective memory and re-emerged centuries later under remarkably familiar guises. Ever heard of a bread bowl? Yes, that steaming chowder vessel at your favorite cafe on a rainy Tuesday is Trencher's great-great-grandchild, proudly continuing the legacy of why bother with dishes when carbs are available. As we move gently through the corridors of time, we notice something wonderful. Humans have always had a strangely persistent passion for combining food and function. The trencher is joined by its buttery cousin, the toast point, once a medieval napkin substitute, now a brunch Instagrammer's prop of choice. Even today's plates made of chocolate or tacos served in a crispy tortilla shell nod subtly to these old edible philosophies. And in case you're wondering, yes, medieval people used to soak their trenchers in wine. Perhaps not the vintage rosés you're picturing, but cheap local brews that doubled as disinfectant and morale booster. After all, hygiene was negotiable, taste was subjective, but dunking bread in wine, that was eternal. Now picture the royal courts. Gold-gilded tapestries, fur-lined seats, and yet trenchers. Even Henry VIII dined from bread on occasion, perhaps between marriage proposals. The court jester would watch, partly for amusement, partly for danger signs. Trenchers were known to collapse under too much goose grease, creating a medieval slip and slide right there in the Great Hall. And what of the etiquette? Medieval diners didn't double dip so much as single scoop and never look back. Spoons were optional, hands were imperative. Eating from trenchers was an intimate affair. Sharing one meant camaraderie, trust, or at the very least, that the other person wasn't currently infectious. Romantic in its own fungal way. Though trenchers eventually fell out of fashion, thanks in part to ceramic plates and the growing awareness that maybe stale bread wasn't the height of luxury, they lingered stubbornly in peasant homes. Like your grandmother's floral china, they weren't flashy, but they worked. So next time you sip clam chowder from a sourdough bowl, or nibble your way through a charcuterie board that's actually made of bread, give a little nod to these crusty companions of medieval mealtime. They may not have made it into fine dining today, but their carb-heavy spirit lives on. As the evening cloaks the village and the hearth embers begin to blink sleepily, We wander now toward another curious relic of medieval manners, one tucked discreetly up a sleeve or spirited away in the folds of a tunic. Let us gently follow the scent of spice and a whisper of habit. Deeper into the night, somewhere between the clattering goblets of a candlelit banquet and the quiet hum of your refrigerator light, comes the ghost of an ancient habit. Faint, crumb-covered, and surprisingly familiar. Let us drift now to the table again. This time, not to slurp spiced pottage or whisper seductively to a meat pie, but rather, curiously, to speak of plates, or rather, the absence of them. You see, in a world that had mastered the art of elaborate feasts but hadn't quite figured out how to make dishwashing less soul-crushing, the medieval solution was ingenious. Just eat your plate, enter the trencher. No, not the delightful earth-moving machine, though one does marvel at the similarities. The medieval trencher was a slice of stale bread, day-old, week-old, or old enough to remember the previous monarch, that served as both plate and eventually dog treat, beggar aid, or poor man's pudding base. It was about 1 inch thick, sturdy enough to hold meaty juices and vegetable mash, and humble enough to be disposable, or edible, or more typically, both. Imagine this. You're a nobleman in 1352, seated among tapestries and trumpet fanfare. A server drops a hunk of wild boar gristle onto your trencher. The juices ooze into the bread's coarse pores. As you dine, the trencher soaks up flavour like a spongy medieval gravy boat. After the meal, you do one of 3 things. Eat it yourself, gift it to the household's less fortunate, or toss it to your favourite hound, whose name is probably something noble like Sir Barksworth. Now, before we get too earnest about the generosity this might imply, let's remember these saturated bread plates were often soggy, with a congealed mixture of grease, wine spills, and medieval mystery, sauces. They weren't quite modern leftovers. They were soggy relics of consumption, which honestly feels like an apt summary of a Tuesday. The trencher may have started as a culinary convenience, but it tapped into something instinctive, something oddly persistent. Today, we might not eat soup from an old loaf, but picture that hamburger cradled in its bun, or the pizza resting on its crispy, edible plate. Tacos, wraps, burritos, trenchers' modern-day cousins in cornflower disguises. Even your morning avocado toast, brimming with poached egg artistry and a light dusting of self-satisfaction, plays a distant tribute to the humble trencher. Proof that even the ancient practice of piling mess onto bread survives as a delicacy of influencers and brunch fanatics. But here's where the bread saga gets even more curious. By the late medieval period, especially in France and Italy, though never quite abandoning the edible method, the trencher began to evolve. Ceramics and pewter arrived at upper-class tables like new kids on the breakfast block. Decorative, washable, and most importantly, non-edible, which by then was becoming fashionable. Yet for the rest of society, including lower nobility and townspeople, the trencher persisted like a loyal carb companion. Bakers even started baking them specially, crafting extra stale loaves optimized for slab duty. There's something quite moving, honestly, about toil-crafted stale bread designed not for taste, but for task. Dedicated slices under the weight of roast goose and turnip puree. Of course, some trenchers weren't bread at all. By the 15th century, wooden trenchers became more common, particularly among those who feared their meal might soak their bread into structural collapse. These platters would often double as writing tablets or game boards when turned over. A dinner plate by day, a mobile chessboard by night. multi-purpose medieval living at its best. As for medieval etiquette, the trencher held certain rules. Sharing was common, especially between lords and their companions. A sign of fellowship, yes, but also a high-yeast version of personal space invasion. And while eager fingers were allowed, using the trencher to, say, wipe your hands mid-course was considered firmly uncouth. Bread or not, a napkin it was not. Today, what remains is not the trencher itself, but its ghost. In picnics where sandwiches cradle the main course, toast piles under scrambled eggs, an open-faced anything is considered a bold, Instagrammable choice. And so, the next time you brush crumbs off your shirt or regard your sandwich with mild awe, whisper a thank you to the feast tables of medieval Europe and the brave, gritty bread slices that dared to be both furniture and food. From these edible platforms, our next curious habit unfurls. A tale not of what rested upon the table, but what flickered gently above it, softly smouldering, stubbornly scented, and suspiciously smoky. But that is, as they say, a tale for another candlelit moment. If you've ever twiddled your thumbs while waiting for a soup to cool, or turned your spoon clockwise, then counterclockwise, like you're performing a culinary waltz, you might unknowingly be continuing a ritual that dates back nearly 1,000 years. You see, the simplicity of stirring soup is deceptive. In the medieval world, eating soup was no mere act of nourishment. Oh no, it was an occasion, a performance, and occasionally, a test of patience that demanded religious fervor, silent gossip, and, curiously, stale bread. They called it sop. Not the most glamorous title, admittedly. Sop was what happened when medieval folk took chunks of stale, rock-hard bread and soaked them in hot broth until they became something between a sponge and a miracle. This wasn't just a budget-saving trick. It was the heart of many meals. To sop one's bread was not just acceptable, it was expected. In a cacophony of slurps and sighs, medieval guests at a lord's table would tear their bread by hand, knives being a potential invitation for dueling if someone didn't like your table manners, and dip it into the communal trenchers or cauldrons. Yes, communal. One pot, many hands. Let your modern, germ-conscious heart shudder now. But here's the quietly enduring part. The practice of bread and broth may have evolved, civilized even, into tomato soup with a grilled cheese sandwich, or a moist baguette dipped lovingly into French onion soup. Yet, conceptually, these are just richly garnished sops of old. The medieval peasant would nod solemnly at your sourdough technique, then ask for seconds. And the spoon, also not always guaranteed. Before it became the standard silver warrior of the dining table, most medieval folks either drank their soup like a beverage or used bits of bread to shovel it. The spoon was reserved for the rich, often intricately carved out of wood, bone, or even horn. Imagine the noble clasping their personal spoon from a purse-like pouch on their belt, whispering to it like it held family secrets. Not the pewter one tonight, dear spoon. We have guests. For the commoners, though, spoons were a luxury, occasionally shared communally, although few wished to be the second person to use it after Uncle Godfrey, who forgot what the word napkin even meant. Speaking of napkins, those also weren't exactly ubiquitous, at least not for the likes of everyone. The medieval answer to messy fingers? The tablecloth. Yes, really. It was perfectly acceptable, if not encouraged, to dab one's hands right onto the cloth spread upon the table. After all, what else was it there for? There wasn't yet a firm cultural line between dishware and linen usage. In fact, the concept of individual dishware, as in "This plate is just mine," was not fully developed. Particularly in earlier medieval periods, trenchers, edible plates made of thick bread, were shared between two diners. To dine from a trencher with someone was a mark of intimacy, or at least a sign that you were both too poor to argue. Still, in these humble practices live echoes of our modern habits. Ever tear a dinner roll in half and pass it to someone else? That's a two-person trencher tradition. Ever dip fries in your milkshake? The spirit of improvisational, bread-centered eating lives on. You may not call it sopping, but every time you reach for something to soak up the last bit of sauce on your plate, you are channeling an ancient appetite. It is muscle memory passed through hands that knew little of restaurants, but much of hunger and hospitality. Even croutons, the darling cubes of modern salad bars, are descendants of the era's eternal question. What shall we do with this old bread? Cube it, spice it, toast it to survivable density, and toss it into broth, or a salad pretending to be a meal. Voila! A legacy is born. So tonight, if you find yourself spooning soup gently, stirring it clockwise, then counterclockwise, like a ritual under candlelight, even if your candlelight is a dim kitchen bulb above the stove, know that you're part of a long, slurpy, bread-soaked tradition. And as we dry our hands on something slightly more appropriate than the tablecloth, perhaps it's time to peek into another corner of the medieval pantry, where the humble pickle hides more secrets than you'd expect. Just when you thought the medieval table had exhausted its eccentricities, we find ourselves face to face with a real unsung hero of historical dining. Trenchers. No, not the British soldiers, and sadly, not a secret guild of medieval mole people. Trenchers, my dear drowsy listener, were edible plates made from thick slices of stale bread. Yes, plates of bread. Let's begin with the facts, delicately buttered. In the high Middle Ages, when forks were still viewed with great suspicion, looking like tiny torture devices, and spoons were honourable but overworked, trenchers were the culinary multitaskers of their day. Picture a thick slab of yesterday's coarse bread, perhaps wholemeal, perhaps rye, depending on who your local lord happened to be looting or trading with. This stale, noble square functioned as both crockery and a sponge, absorbing gravies, catching errant dribbles of stew, and by the end of the meal, becoming what could only be described as an edible mop of medieval flavour. The word trencher comes from the Old French trancher, meaning to cut, and indeed, cutting into a meal on one of these crusty platforms meant not only approaching your food with gusto, but accepting that your plate may very well be dessert. The rich, of course, rarely consumed their trenchers. Instead, these food-soaked breadboards were sent off to the poor or chucked to the dogs, depending on the temperament of the kitchen or the generosity of the hosts. 1,000 years before compost bins made us feel environmentally virtuous, the medievals were feeding leftover gravy slabs to the grateful and the furry alike. Now, you might be wondering, what whispers of trenchers survive today? Well, consider this. Next time you find yourself gnawing on the last sauce-smeared morsel of your pizza crust, know that you, too, are dining like a 14th century yeoman. Or when you fold a soft tortilla up like a makeshift plate to scoop your chili, partake in the archaic joy of dual-purpose dining ware. Even that soggy biscuit at the bottom of your chicken pot pie nods humbly toward its ancestor, the trencher, the pioneer of edible infrastructure. And think about garlic bread served under spaghetti, or the humble open-face sandwich, all echoes of that old cuttable plate. The trencher is not gone, It has simply shapeshifted, toasted itself into invisibility, and slipped mysteriously into the modern menu. A quiet stowaway from feasting halls long gone. Back in the medieval great halls, trenchers were frequently placed two to a pair, shared between two diners, often strangers. This introduced all the drama and social protocol one might imagine. Arguments over who had the larger portion, disputes over whether drooled gravy counts as claimed territory, and awkward interruptions if your dining mate audibly chewed or chewed audibly. The cutting of social classes was quite literal sometimes. Nobody wanted to be caught with trenchers that were too soft. It implied either poor baking or worse, poor status. But lest you think the trencher was without refinement, some wealthy households actually seasoned them. That's right. Spiced trenchers scented with saffron, cinnamon, and occasionally bits of lard or dried fruit. A medieval twist on today's artisan-flavored bread, though probably less ideal for mopping up mutton stew. It seems even then people could not resist complicating things just a pinch too far. Of course, in time, ceramic and pewter dishes grew, more affordable, and trenchers fell out of fashion among the upper crust, pun drowsily intended. Yet they remained useful at fairs, among soldiers, and in households where today's dinner might still be waiting for tomorrow's dough to rise. Somehow, the idea, the edible holder, the food that carries food, never really left us. And perhaps that's no surprise. The medieval world, cumbersome though it may appear from afar, had a knack for practical enchantments like this. A bread plate that becomes your pudding. It was a solution before solutions became problems. As the candlelight of that great dining hall flickers low, and the last trencher disappears into the grateful mouth of a passing hound, we turn gently to another relic of the medieval table, one that, curiously enough, still occupies our kitchen drawers with a stubborn quietness. In the gentle stillness of a medieval evening, when the moon climbed lazily over thatched rooftops, and somewhere a piglet snorted, disapproval at the concept of bedtime, supper was treated less like a meal and more like a mildly chaotic theatre production. You see, what we think of today as eating dinner with forks, napkins, and perhaps a Spotify jazz playlist would have looked to a medieval diner like sheer sorcery, possibly demonic. Instead, their habits, shaped by faith, folklore, and the peculiar physics of trenchers, have shuffled forward into our modern world like quiet but determined ghosts. Let us begin with the bread bowl. Yes, that rustic accessory you might now encounter in trendy soup cafes, cradling creamy chowder, or a tomato bisque with goat cheese foam. That humble bread vessel is no modern Instagrammer's invention. In the medieval world, it was called a trencher, and it was both plate and most poetically, compass bin. The trencher began as a thick slice of stale bread, not chosen for its flavor, but for its ability to support a ladleful of stew without sobbing under the pressure. After your average peasant finished their pottage, a charmingly vague stew that contained whatever the garden coughed up that week, the trencher might be eaten, given to the poor, or thrown to the dogs under the trestle table. That's right. Your plate had a post-meal destiny. It was a dinner with a plot twist. And while we're poking around beneath the table, let's talk about salt. No, not sea salt caramel or Himalayan pink pyramid flakes. We're talking about the little pile of salt that landed on medieval tables with all the gravitas of a royal seal. Salt was expensive, precious, and not just a seasoning, but a social cue. Its placement on the table quite literally divided the guests. Those seated above the salt were the honoured elite. Those below, well, let's just say their trencher was probably more stale than usual. To this day, The phrase above the salt survives in dusty English idioms and the occasional overly subtle Austen adaptation. And speaking of salt and status, let's glide over to another medieval mainstay that twinkles oddly in modern times: the ceremonial washing of hands before meals. Nowadays, we've got foaming lavender soap and musical cues to scrub for 2 happy choruses of Happy Birthday. But back then, it was a solemn and mildly theatrical affair. Before feasting, a servant would bring out a basin and pitcher, and your host would receive the hand washing like a minor god, being anointed in their own dining room. No one particularly questioned why your fingers were probably caked in mud and mystery. What mattered was the symbolic cleansing of the hands before diving wrist-deep into pottage. But here's the twist. Utensils were viewed by many with deep suspicion. Forks, those now innocent instruments of cake spearing and salad flipping, were in their infancy. Some medieval church figures went so far as to denounce them as sinful. Why, they reasoned, must a man eat with iron prongs like the devil when God gave him fingers? The logic, though dubious, was oddly consistent, and so meals were eaten with knives, used mostly to cut, not scoop, spoons for brothy things, and a goodly set of fingers, preferably yours. The communal aspect of dipping your hand into the same bowl as your neighbor was less about hygiene and more about unity, or perhaps a medieval test of friendship. Yet even today, in finger foods, family-style platters, or the all hail the humble chip and dip soiree, that echo of shared plates and unforked feasting endures. There is something oddly comforting in those tangents of tradition. We may wield antibacterial hand wipes and high-tech air fryers, but the traces of these odd rituals have scuttled alongside us, clinging like sleepy barnacles to the ship of modern dining. And just before the last candle sputters out in this banquet of bygone custom, there's one more morsel to nibble. Grace before meals. In medieval households, especially noble and monastic ones, no one dared carve a parsnip until someone had either said thanks or chanted an entire psalm, depending on the degree of holiness at the table. While today's pre-meal rituals have diversified into silent thank yous, Instagram all-clear signals, or hurried apologies for burnt garlic bread, the idea of pausing before a meal remains curiously intact. So the next time you break bread, literal or gluten-free, remember that somewhere in that simple motion there lingers 1,000 years of peculiar, passionate, and often bread-based history. And as the plates are cleared, the trencher destined for some lucky dog or empty belly, another medieval habit flickers quietly to life behind cellar doors and aged barrels: fermentation. But that, dear dreamer, is a story brewing just ahead. As dusk settled outside a thatched-roofed cottage somewhere in the year 1382, a deeply held truth echoed through the clattering halls of the manor and the wind-whipped lanes of the village. No one, and I mean no one, ate with forks. Now, you might be tempted to imagine a medieval feast as a glorious candlelit orgy of glistening roasts and goblets, perhaps with swans served in feathered regalia and a lute ensemble plucking melodically in the corner. And while that isn't entirely wrong, there was one little hiccup ruining the image for the modern mind. They were all eating with their hands. Not just the peasants, mind you. We're talking dukes, duchesses, bishops, who smelled like myrrh and self-importance. All digging fingers, sometimes even entire fists, into communal dishes of meat pies and honey-glazed ham. Because in the medieval world, God made fingers before cutlery, and they worked just fine, thank you. But here's the thing, the fork did exist. Oh yes, it was lurking on the fringes of polite society like an awkward party guest no one knew how to introduce. In 1004, a Byzantine woman named Maria Argyropoulina showed up in Venice for her wedding, fork in hand, literally. She carried with her delicate gold forks, used to eat candied fruits and other dainty delights, much to the horror of the local clergy. One enraged Venetian priest went so far as to say that using a fork was an insult to God himself, suggesting that hands, those divine appendages, were all one really needed. Maria, of course, suffered from what the chronicles called a grievous illness and died shortly after. Her funeral included a subtle, victory-scented whisper of divine vindication. Moral of the story: forks were somehow more dangerous than marrying into the Byzantine elite. Still, those odd little pronged things refused to crawl back into obscurity. By the late Middle Ages, they began whispering their way north. Italians adopted them first, because of course they did. Pasta, after all, is not a hand food, and trying to scoop up strands of linguine with your fingers turns every meal into a slapstick opera. Gradually, the fork crept onto upper-class dinner tables, disguised as something called a split spoon. We kid you not. It balanced modestly between its spoon and spear identities, trying its best not to alarm anyone, sort of like an undercover agent, hoping no one would notice its tines. But resistance remained fierce. Even Queen Elizabeth I reportedly avoided forks, preferring to use her soul-blessed fingers or, for particularly tricky foods, a knife and spoon duet. Still, by the 17th century, travellers returning from France and Italy started bringing back these pronged curiosities with evangelistic zeal. Imagine hosting a dinner party in 1650s England and revealing your latest continental acquisition by dramatically spearing a lump of roast goose with your fork. Your guests would gasp softly, then squint in judgment, debating whether you were stylish or simply possessed. But even as forks tiptoed their way into elite society, there remained a stubborn medieval remnant, the refusal to adopt them at breakfast. Unlike suppers and feasts, breakfast remained achingly humble well into the modern age. Often eaten alone or quickly in bustling kitchens, breakfast relied upon stews, porridge, crusty bread, or blessed ale, all things that required either slurping, spooning, or tearing. The fork, with its high society airs and awkward tines, was simply too formal for this intimate, usually unsupervised meal. And yet, next time you eat scrambled eggs with a fork, notice its quiet rebellion. You're unknowingly part of a once controversial history of utensil politics. The survival of the fork, slow and stealthy, is nothing short of culinary espionage. There's even a touch of poetic irony that today, humans can eat an entire meal with a single spork, a fusion utensil that would have sent those medieval nobles flailing back into their chairs. So let us raise our mismatched cutlery drawers to the medieval diners who soldiered on, stabbing roast pig with knives and daubing gravy with hunks of bread. They could never have imagined a world where forks not only survived, but were used to eat salad. Tomorrow, we'll turn gently to something even less sharp, bread itself, and how its medieval roles went far beyond sandwich making. A toasted tale awaits. By the flickering firelight of a medieval hearth, you might have witnessed a peculiar little ritual. Bread, not as food, but as furniture. It was called a trencher, a thick, day-old slice of coarse bread, used like a dinner plate. Picture a dependable sourdough coaster, patiently absorbing gravies, mutton grease, and perhaps the tears of a slightly overcooked parsnip. Once the meal was devoured, the gravy-logged trencher either became dinner part 2 or was handed over to the needy as a sort of charitable, edible Tupperware. It was sustainability with crumbs, Now, while we've thankfully progressed beyond using food as crockery, mostly, the idea of bread as vessel has curiously survived. Consider the modern bread bowl, that hearty sourdough stuffed with soup, stew, or for the particularly reckless, macaroni and cheese. It is the gourmet cousin of the medieval trencher. Tidier, yes, but no less soaked. And let's be honest, biting into a soup-drenched crust after a long Tuesday feels more indulgent than it logically should. And the medievals didn't stop at bread furniture. They were intense believers in edible symbolism. Food that wasn't simply nourishment, but message. Decorated pies, for example, were practically edible PowerPoint presentations. One such delicacy, the cockentrice, was a Frankensteinian creature stitched together from parts of a pig and parts of a bird, usually the back end of a pig and the front of a goose, because obviously nothing whets the appetite quite like culinary taxidermy. If you're wondering whether we've departed from such culinary pageantry, well, perhaps you've noticed Instagram. In a way, modern food stylists are the medieval pie engineers of our time. Swap out goose pig hybrids for rainbow-layered coffee drinks and structural pancakes, and the spirit isn't that different. It's still food that makes a statement before it makes a meal. But if there's a medieval habit we've rescued most thoroughly, it's the relationship between eating and etiquette, a constellation of table behaviors born not of manners, but of mild sanitation panic. You see, forks in medieval Europe were seen as slightly suspicious. They came late to the party, somewhere around the 11th century in Italy, and were received with the sort of cautious side-eye one might reserve for someone insisting on using chopsticks for cereal. Your average table was an odd blend of class, chaos, and cutlery innovation. Noblemen might dabble with two-pronged forks, but the common folk wielded knives and fingers with fearless efficiency. No forks, no napkins, at least not individual ones, and no real sense of picky eating. One was expected to share drinking cups, use the same knife for every course, and pretend not to notice the stray hay drifting into the stew. Some of these customs faded, but some evolved. Today, we may raise eyebrows at the idea of sharing a goblet, but the germ of the drink dynamic is alive and well each time someone says, "Just one bite," and stabs your fries. Medieval dining etiquette echoes faintly in the unspoken rules of today's dinner tables, where elbows, chewing volume, and salad fork deployment remain fiercely regulated codes of conduct. Even the notion of washing hands before meals wasn't always just about cleanliness. In many grand medieval feasts, guests would be ceremonially offered a damp cloth, or even have their hands sprinkled with rosewater, not for hygiene, but for a whiff of ritual. It was swagger, framed as sanitation. These moments have survived as that small bowl of lemon water that appears with suspicious discretion at seafood restaurants. Still, not entirely explainable, but very luxurious. And lest that we forget the place of salt, a substance so revered that sitting above or below the salt became code for your status at the table. Salt was often held in ornate containers called salt cellars, placed prominently where only the highest-ranking individuals could reach. Contrast that with today, where salt is found in small cylindrical shakers decorated with hard plastic sombreros. The fall from grace has been considerable. Still, the act of seasoning to taste, of gently adjusting a dish's flavor to fit one's personal palate, remains one of the most direct descendants of those early salt rites. In fact, every time you reach for the salt shaker at breakfast, you're gently echoing a tradition once reserved for nobility. And so, from trencher bread plates to salt symbolism, certain medieval dining habits never quite vanished. They simply changed their hats and learned to smile for photos. Let's wander next, quietly now, toward the world of medieval fasting, where denial of food led not to hunger headaches, but to a strange, celebratory cuisine all its own. In the quiet gloom of medieval dining halls, lit only by the flicker of beeswax and tallow, there existed a curious obsession with food placement, not simply the arrangement on one's trencher, which was increasingly a slab of stale bread rather than crockery, but rather the pecking order of the table itself. You see, where you sat when you feasted told others not just your rank, but quite possibly your aspirations, alliances, and whether or not you were about to be gently assassinated in a spoon duel. It was common practice for the high table to be literally on a dais, an elegant platform, slightly raised, just enough to make everyone crane their necks like peckish storks. This wasn't a simple bid for legroom, it was status with a capital S, often flanked by embroidered tapestries depicting mythical beasts, real saints, and occasionally, really optimistic interpretations of lions. The lord, or the lady, or the visiting bishop, depending on whose castle and whose roast pheasant it was, sat at the centre, and radiating outward was a sort of political topography. The closer you were to the centre, the higher your favour. Sit too far down, and you'd end up next to the hounds, or worse, assigned to the saltless end of the pork. And oh yes, salt. A seemingly humble condiment, but in medieval times, salt was the edible equivalent of a Swiss bank account. Expensive, vitally useful, and prone to being smugly displayed. The phrase "below the salt" referred to those seated so far from the Lord they weren't even trusted with a pinch of the precious white dust, let alone a spoonful. And that spoonful? It was often wooden or pewter, occasionally inherited, and sometimes, if one were particularly important or particularly lucky, made of bone. Now one might ask, what does all this have to do with the modern dinner party, where one fights not for proximity to salt, but to avoid sitting opposite the person who talks about cryptocurrency over quiche? Quite a lot, oddly. Even today, hosts will agonize over place cards like they're defusing a royal bomb. Who will sit next to Aunt Margaret, the family tea spiller? Who must endure the enthusiastic chewing sounds of Cousin Brian? Entire sitcom episodes could be reduced to the refined stress of rearranging a dinner table to avoid a diplomatic incident. This modern dance of seating charts is the faded echo of medieval banquet hierarchies. A sort of social cartography evolved from those trestled days of goose feasts and doublets. Much like how no one is quite sure why we butter bread with a knife rather than our fingers, certain customs have simply lingered. Even the concept of a head of the table is a direct inheritance from those medieval arrangements. Today's business meetings and family dinners still place the person of authority or the birthday girl there. Leftover artifacts from centuries of etiquette anxiety. Back then, you weren't just eating, you were performing. Forks hadn't really caught on yet, seen by many as effeminate little prongs of the devil. So most diners used three impeccable tools: a knife, a spoon, and the hand they weren't wiping on their tunic. Manners were observed in spirit, if not in practice. Talking with your mouth full was discouraged, but not punishable. Offering the best morsel of meat to your neighbor was expected, especially if you wanted to politely suggest they not rebel against you next harvest. Interestingly, some of these habits quietly crept into more recent traditions. The passing of shared dishes clockwise, for example, has a long history rooted not only in right-handed courtesy, but in primitive notions of good fortune. and you thought your cousin's insistence that we always start with the mashed potatoes was just stubbornness. Then there's the curious habit of saying grace, which once wasn't just religious custom, but a vital societal signal. In medieval times, it was the sacred moment to show piety, express gratitude, and scope out who was slipping kidneys to the dog under the table. Today, its remnants remain a quiet moment before eating, or at the very least, a deep breath to prepare oneself for chewing through one's feelings with a dry dinner roll. As the candle smoke curled toward the thatched beams, and the evening wound on with mead-fueled toasts and roasted marrow bones, our medieval ancestors knew there was more to the meal than the food. There were alliances, politics, power dynamics, all served family style with a soupçon of passive aggression. So next time you sit for dinner and notice father is again at the head of the table, Susan is artfully avoiding eye contact with the gravy boat, and the salt seems to be guarding itself like a tiny shivering totem. Remember that this seemingly ordinary supper is but a distant descendant of rituals carved into oaken banquet halls where power, prestige, and the proximity to pickled eel mattered greatly indeed. And just beyond the reach of the table candles, a new dining quirk was already being born, one that had less to do with food and more to do with the fingers used to handle it. When we think of fast food, we usually imagine something wrapped in paper, ordered through a speaker box, and passed through a window with a smile that may or may not reach the eyes. But fast food, like awkward family dinners and mysteriously sticky tables, has older roots than you might suspect. In fact, medieval Europe had its own version of drive-through dining, just with slightly more mud, fewer carbs, and a concerning lack of napkins. Let your mind wander, if gently, to a bustling medieval street around the 14th century. Horses clop lazily over cobbles, someone is probably shouting about turnips, and the air carries the thick perfume of cook fires smoked with mutton, onions, and maybe, if it's payday, goose. You might imagine medieval folk devoured their meals at wooden tables in smoky great halls with goblets of wine and awkward lute solos. Sometimes, yes. But in the everyday rhythm of life, most people were just as busy, distracted, and underfed as we are. Enter the pie. Not the sugar-laced, syrupy kind meant to feature as the terrifying centerpiece of a family Thanksgiving, but the humble, savory hand pie, portable, affordable, and ever so medieval. Street vendors crammed pies full of meat scraps, leeks, or whatever the butcher had too much of that week. Some pies were even sealed with thick layers of inedible crust used like a natural Tupperware. These crusts were called coffins, which seems a bit grim until you realize they were also used to store leftover food, and potentially a little symbolism about what happened to pigeons that wandered too close to the oven. And it wasn't just pies. Fast-tracked medieval meals included trenchers, slices of stale bread used as makeshift plates. After absorbing the juices of stews and meats, these edible placemats were either eaten or fed to the poor, or fed to pigs pretending to be poor. You never really knew. It's helpful to picture a world where carbs were not just dinner, but also dining ware. There were also the soup vendors with their steaming pots balanced precariously on street corners. They'd ladle out broths into wooden bowls or into your hands if you forgot your medieval thermos. For a penny or less, customers could scarf down hot pottage thickened with oats, beans, and possibly the illusion of herbs. And then there were the fishmongers. Oh, the fishmongers. Particularly helpful on meatless Fridays, they'd cook up eel pies, fried salt herring, or mysterious carp-based concoctions that required the strong stomach and stronger teeth of the average peasant. Fish were especially important because in a world deeply governed by the church calendar, you had over 150 days a year where meat of the four-legged variety was off the menu, which meant a lot of meals that swam before they sizzled. Now, what's perhaps most amusing is that many of these slapdash medieval meals created the blueprint that fast food empires would later gentrify with branding, jingles, and occasional hot sauce packets. Convenience food, it turns out, wasn't born from the drive-through, but from the muddy streets of York and Paris and smelly London, where workers and weavers needed something they could eat while standing, or hiding from the latest outbreak of something unpleasant. Even the idea of menu items existed. At many little cookshops or stalls, called cookshops not just because someone was cooking, but because it felt like the medieval version of a hole-in-the-wall restaurant, you could find a standard rotation of offerings: pottage, pie, maybe a small ale if the cook was in a generous mood, or the local bishop wasn't looking. And all of this fast food culture was served with minimal ceremony, often consumed using only hands, teeth, and a prayer. Forks, as you might recall, hadn't seduced Europe yet, and if a knife was involved, it was usually the one you brought with you, because good guests in the Middle Ages didn't just bring conversational charm, they brought cutlery. So, next time you find yourself chewing through drive-through fries while checking your emails and trying not to spill ranch dressing on your shirt, remember that medieval folk once hurried down cobbled alleyways with a steaming hand pie, a wooden spoon, and likely sauce on their tunic long before you did. Perhaps convenience cuisine is less a modern miracle and more our oldest, tastiest vice. And speaking of vices, well, not sins exactly, but temptations nonetheless. Let us gently carry ourselves into the twilight world of medieval sweets, because where there were pies and trenchers, there was also sugar, or what passed for it. Somewhere between the roaring hearths of medieval banquet halls and the late-night contents of your fridge door lies one of the quieter, curiouser habits of mealtime history. Eating with your hands. Yes, your fingers, those 10 little evolutionary marvels, once held goose thighs in the highest esteem. In our modern world, where salad forks and soup spoons get their own seating charts, it's easy to forget that for centuries, utensils were optional, fancy, even suspicious. In medieval Europe, the idea of personal cutlery was still working on its resume. Knives were common, yes, but more as utility tools than dining accoutrement. Only the nobility might carry a personal knife to use at the table, alongside a heap of status anxiety. Spoons existed too, usually for soups and porridges, which were a medieval staple because they were both economical and merciful on dentally disadvantaged jaws. But forks, the fork, that snub-nosed prongy interloper. It took a long while to get any real traction. Early versions appeared in the Middle East and Byzantine Empire centuries before Western Europe even considered giving them a seat. When a Byzantine princess, Theophano, married into the Venetian court in the 11th century and brought her tiny golden forks with her, the pious citizens of Venice were scandalized. Outrageous, they decried, the devil's toothpick. Religious scholars, clearly not invited to many fun dinners, declared that God had given us fingers and impaling food with iron was ungodly. Theophano herself died young, which, uncoincidentally, some attributed to divine punishment for forsaking hand-to-food contact. And so, despite all the royal drama, bread once reigned as both plate and tool. Our medieval cousins perfected the use of trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible dinner plates. A roast would be placed atop this sturdy, fair, After meals, the meat-soaked bread could be eaten, fed to the dogs, or more charitably, given to the poor. Though one imagines the poor people might have wished for slightly fewer noble teeth marks. There were dining manners of a sort. Don't be fooled by the lack of forks into thinking there was license to just dive in. One was expected to wash hands before sitting, especially the right hand, the knightly hand, the soup-scooping hand. Guests were forbidden from licking their fingers loudly or using the communal salt bowl as a dip. But here's the thing. Long after cutlery caught on and elbows were banished from tables, the medieval hand-fed meal persisted in sly, subtle ways. Take the humble sandwich. Though John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, richly gets the credit for its invention in the 18th century, reportedly to keep playing cards grease-free, every culture had already discovered the joy of wrapping meat in bread centuries earlier. But medieval folk were chomping on meat and bread combos with abandon, using food to hold more food, and probably wiping their hands on their trouser legs like unapologetic legends. Fast forward to today, and you'll find our fingers still quietly employed in ways that hark back to those simpler, messier dinners. French fries, chicken wings, tacos, crackers, apple slices. We've rationalized it. We say, it just tastes better when you use your hands. Perhaps we're not wrong. Perhaps your nervous system enjoys the tactile preparation, the anticipatory squish of mozzarella before your teeth get involved. Even in posh dinners, there are secret survivors. Hors d'oeuvres designed for tactile consumption. Bread baskets with butter knives left. Mysteriously out of reach. And don't forget the informal cheese board shuffle, where everyone pretends to use the tiny tongs, but ultimately just pokes around directly. Ancestral instincts at their finest. Interestingly, in some Asian and African traditions, eating with hands was never abandoned and never deemed improper. It was, and remains, a sacred and intimate part of the meal. Fingers are seen as tools of connection, gesture, and flavor. Even Ayurveda, that ancient Indian system of wellness, suggests that eating with your hands awakens nerves, harmonizes energy, and enhances digestion. So while forks eventually found their groove in Europe, the medieval hand meal didn't fully perish. It adapted. It went stealth. It lives quietly now, under pizza slices and barbecue ribs, in cocktail napkins and cupcake wrappers. Your midnight nibble of fridge cheese. Medieval behavior in modern pajamas. And so, we salute the forgotten fingers of the feast, those tools of flavor and function that never wholly fell away. In the gentle flicker of a pub candle or the glow of a microwave clock, they find work yet. And in a most poetic twist, many of us still start and end our days with food clutched straight in hand. Now, that leaves us with a mystery slinking just beneath the crust of familiarity. A once humble stew that shaped empires and governed peasant lives alike. But we'll dip our spoon into that tale. Soon, as twilight spilled its velvety cloak across the medieval countryside, there emerged a strange and surprisingly persistent habit, determining your social worth in soup. Not metaphorical soup, real, actual, bubbling soup. In the Middle Ages, one's proximity to the soup pot wasn't just about warming your hands. It was a map of status, a culinary compass that told you where you belonged in life. Imagine, you're invited to a grand feast at the manor of some minor noble who owns more livestock than personal charm. The long table stretches before you like a tapestry of intentions. Seated at the high end, literally raised on a wooden platform, are the nobility. Their soup is warm, rich, and freshly ladled from the pot. By the time bowls are filled down at the opposite end, where the poor, shepherd's cousin twice removed is wedged between a squire's horse groom and a woman who sells onions with a suspicious twinkle in her eye. The soup is no longer hot. It's a tepid puddle of social disappointment. The phrase "sitting above the salt" stems from this very notion. Salt, prized and pricey, was placed in a central spot on the table. Those sitting between the salt and the lord were in favour. Those sitting below the salt were, well, still part of the feast, but no one expected them to make conversation with the baron about estate taxes or owl husbandry, which was, yes, a questionable medieval pastime. Now, this whole thing, ranking people by their dinner seats, feels like a relic, doesn't it? And yet, think of today's weddings or gala dinners, still putting Uncle Geoffrey near the kitchen and the major donors near the head table. That medieval instinct to communicate social order through food geography has yet to take its final nap, but perhaps the most enduring legacy from this odd world of soup stratification was not seating, but slurping. In some periods of the Middle Ages, the idea of using a spoon at all was considered suspiciously pretentious for the lower classes. Liquids, broths, and gravies were slurped with conviction. A hearty slurp was, in some circles, the only reasonable way to sign off on a good meal. It was practical, loud, and uniquely unbothered. Manners be damned. If the soup was tasty, your slurp was your standing ovation. That said, slurping has wobbled in and out of fashion over the centuries, popping its sonic head into different cultures with dramatically different reputations. In Japan, slurping noodles became a sign of appreciation. In Victorian England, it was enough to cause a fainting spell at the dinner table. In medieval Europe, it was just normal, or at least tolerated, as long as the slurper wasn't also sneaking the last piece of eel pie. And then there was the curious case of communal trenchers. Rather than individual plates, meals were shared atop stale slabs of bread, trenchers, that doubled as serving platters. You, your neighbour, and perhaps a visiting friar would all scoop food from the same slightly mouldy bread base. If you were particularly lucky, the trencher would soak up the gravy and be gifted to the poor the next day. Less lucky, you'd be expected to clean the trencher with your own bread crust or some sort of edible triangle of linen, if you happen to be a trendsetter. This idea, communal eating from a shared vessel, quietly persisted. Think of fondue pots, hot pots, shared dining platters in many traditional cultures. The idea that food doesn't have to be partitioned into square ceramic islands remains, even today. And while we've replaced trenchers with charcuterie boards and dinner atop bread with, more often than not, dinner atop a gluten-free cracker, the core concept endures like a well-salted stew. Nourishment and togetherness, all in one bite. And perhaps the oddest medieval eating habit that lingered was not about what you ate, or even how, but when. The timing of meals was governed not by appetite or sunlight, or even the call of a grumbling belly. No, it often fell to bells, literal bells. Monasteries used them to regulate prayer and meal times, so farmers and townsfolk often structured their daily eating around those same tolls. You didn't eat lunch because you were hungry. You ate lunch because Brother Benedict rang the third bell of terce. Even now, the echo of those bells remains. What is a modern school lunch hour or office coffee break, if not the descendant of monks tolling a bell for peas and penance? As the aromas of medieval kitchens fade into the fog of time, the dining table remains one of the quietest mirrors of history. Sometimes it's not swords or sonnets that tell the richer stories. It's soup, slurps, and the slow clink of a spoon in a shared dish. Now, speaking of bells, Have you ever wondered why medieval monks never seemed particularly sleepy, despite waking up at the most unreasonable hours imaginable? There's something deeply strange about their midnight snacks. As twilight gently fell over medieval Europe, casting long, sleepy shadows across cobblestone streets and castle courtyards, an odd little ritual was quietly taking shape in countless homes and halls. The curious custom of post-dinner hand-washing. Now, on first blush, this may seem like good hygiene, something your modern self might applaud with a polite squirt of lavender soap. But in the Middle Ages, hand-washing wasn't merely about cleanliness. Oh no, it was an elaborate, fragrant affair, wrapped in pageantry and the faint scent of orange blossoms. You see, dinner in the medieval world was not neatly contained with individual plates and sanitized cutlery. Instead, most meals were spread across a shared wooden platter called a trencher. A charming arrangement if you liked your stew infused with your neighbor's elbow. Before and after meals, hands were both the primary utensils and the recipients of great culinary enthusiasm. So naturally, something had to be done afterward to keep hands from becoming permanently poulticed in roast goose and gravy. Enter the ewer and basin, elegant water vessels accompanied by finely embroidered towels, often spritzed with rosewater or herbs. Guests at noble feasts would receive a gracious hand-washing from a servant, sometimes even from the host themselves, making it less a matter of hygiene and more a performative ritual of hospitality. It was the medieval equivalent of a scented candle and a gentle playlist, a little flourish to ease the transition from meat to merry conversation. But hand-washing was just the beginning. The post-feasting rituals didn't end with wet palms. As the flickering lights of beeswax candles dimmed, medieval diners leaned into the comfort of digestion with something even more familiar to modern ears, the after-dinner mint. Medieval folks didn't have Tic Tacs, mind you, but they knew a thing or two about freshening their breath. Anise seeds, dried fennel, coriander, or candied ginger were passed around the table in what was known as a comfit, essentially a bite-sized sweet covered in sugar and sometimes perfume, because why not taste like violets after roast boar? These mildly spiced sugar-dusted pearls did more than clear the breath of oniony sins. They were medicinal, believed to aid digestion, settle the stomach, and prevent something called humoral imbalance, which sounds like what you get after attending one too many 14th century puppet shows. As the guests nibbled their way to mintier moods, a curious protocol continued to unfold, the ritual of retiring to the solar. This was the after-dinner migration to a cozier, more intimate space, usually a warmer upper room, lit with a hearth and stocked with cushions that had seen both secrets and snoring. There one might sip warm wine infused with cloves and nutmeg, the medieval precursor to your grandma's mulled cider, and engage in the gentle art of chatting while subtly unbuckling your belt. To spice up this digestive hour, there was sometimes music, perhaps a lute, softly plucked, or some earnest recorder playing that sounded remarkably like a duck reconsidering its life choices. And of course, there was storytelling, tales of local legends, historical conquests, or the time a goose stole a bishop's hat and became the village mayor for 3 minutes. Yes, it was an odd time. All this, the perfumed hand-washing, the aniseed kisses, the mellow mead in post-dinner side rooms, survives, faintly echoed in our own habits. Today, we light candles and pour decaf tea. We chew gum at dinner parties and retreat to the living room as if it were our own modern-day solar. We set down plate and fork, and without fully realizing it, we step gracefully into patterns rehearsed by people centuries gone, their fingerprints still lingering faintly on the rituals they passed down. Just now, with fewer ewers and slightly more couch. As night deepens around the manor, and woolen cloaks are drawn tighter against the cool swirling through stone walls, we'll gently follow the footsteps of hands washed and stories told, heading into the next piece of our shared sleepy supper from the past. If you've ever walked into a modern dinner party and silently wondered why there's an extra fork beside your plate that appears to have no clear mission, you might just be feeling the ghost of medieval dining manners gently poking your elbow. Let us now wander into the surprisingly elaborate world of medieval cutlery, or rather, the world that stubbornly refused it. In the early Middle Ages, the concept of using a utensil instead of simply diving into your food with clean, well, reasonably clean, fingers was a bit controversial. Many Europeans regarded the fork as effeminate, foreign, and faintly sinful, probably invented by someone who didn't appreciate the tactile pleasure of butter-soaked fingers. After all, why would one jab at a roasted goose with a cold bit of metal when you had 10 perfectly good digits and a rebellious sense of dignity? The fork, despite having been around since the Byzantines were still enthusiastically wallpapering domes with gold mosaics, didn't truly catch on in Western Europe until the 16th and 17th centuries. Before that, all you really needed was some bread, a dull knife, and a strong stomach. The knife was a trusty companion, a kind of culinary Swiss army blade, used for cutting, lifting, spreading, and occasionally as a toothpick. This is why many medieval meals were served on trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that acted as edible plates. And yes, they were eventually eaten, sometimes by the guests, but more often handed to the poor waiting near the kitchen door. We might call it composting by charity. The so-called civility of table settings took quite some time to evolve. Picture a banquet table in the year 1300. Elbows abounded, burps were conversational punctuation, and spicy sauces were prized as much to show wealth as to disguise yesterday's meat. Diners shared goblets with their neighbors and thought little of it. Germ theory, you see, was centuries away, and back then, a strong immune system was just part of your divine birthright. Of course, even in the midst of such chaos, dining rituals didn't lack rules. They were simply rules of a different flavor. For one, you were expected to bring your own knife to dinner, particularly when visiting someone else's manor. Hosts weren't expected to provide them, sort of the way modern BYOB parties work, but for stabbing meat instead of selecting Merlot. And then there was the curious business with hands. While forks were still exiled to the continent, it was extremely important to use only your first 3 fingers when eating, the thumb, index, and middle finger, as the last 2 were considered, well, common. Peasants used all 5. Nobility, naturally, preferred their fingers rare and refined. Now, fast forward to today. You might notice that formal place settings occasionally present not 1, but 2 of everything, arranged in an order that seems fine-tuned to confuse the sleep-deprived diner. Multiple forks, an embarrassment of spoons, and a bread plate sitting aloof, like it has its own zodiac sign. Such elegance, such restraint, and yet every piece in that setting owes some glimmer of its shape and etiquette to medieval habits that once dictated when you could blow your nose, or with which hand you shouldn't handle cheese. And we still say breaking bread, because we literally did, not as a metaphor, but as a method. Bread crusts broke easily into makeshift scooping devices. useful for both soup and social boundaries. Sharing a trencher with someone was a sign of trust. Doing so without licking your fingers too enthusiastically was a sign of finesse. Even the order of courses, from soup to meat to something sweet, is a filtered echo of how meals were once structured according to humoral theory. The idea that hot and cold, wet and dry foods must be artfully sequenced lest you invite apocalyptic indigestion. Today's appetizers and palate cleansers might seem modern on the plate, but their roots are medieval salves for nervous bellies. So the next time your salad fork feels unnecessary, or you wonder why you've been issued a special spoon just for dessert, remember, it could all be worse. At least no one's expecting you to carry your own cutlery in a belt pouch or politely eat off 6-day-old bread. And there, under dim lighting, as candles flicker and dinner music murmurs, think fondly of the medieval banquets full of clinking knives, trenchers crusted with gravy, and hands reaching a little too far across the table, all quietly living on in our modern rituals of dining. Now, as our table quiets and the last imaginary goblet is drained, let's take our leave, stepping softly into the realms of fragrance and flavor, where the next peculiar habit still lingers on the tip of history's tongue. If you've ever paused mid-sandwich and marveled at the humble napkin, folded neatly, resting beside your plate like a loyal linen sentry, you may not know that this customary cloth comes with a rather blotchy past, marked with grease, crusty fingers, and more than a few regrettable tunic stains. In medieval Europe, for the better part of several centuries, napkins, as we think of them, didn't really exist. Instead, the good folk of the table wiped their hands on something slightly more democratic, the tablecloth itself. Yes, truly, the lavishly embroidered damask tablecloth wasn't merely a feasting backdrop. It doubled as one communal sprawling napkin. You'd reach out, find a cleanish spot along the linen landscape, and give your fingers a hearty swipe of medieval satisfaction, a sort of gesture that said, "I've finished my mutton, and now this floral embroidery shall know it too." At the fanciest of feasts, think Norman barons with turkey legs and questionable dental hygiene, lords might designate tidy little zones along the cloth for wiping. These were called nappies, from the Latin mappa, meaning cloth or towel. So yes, our modern napkin has etymological fingerprints in that very swipe. But even the poor weren't left entirely to their tunics. Many would simply use their sleeves, a practice startlingly efficient, if not particularly polite or clean. In taverns and long communal halls, a peasant with oily hands and a turnip to chase would think nothing of a quick wipe on the cuff, or even the hair if it was convenient. Hair, after all, regrows. Table settings, less so. Of course, nothing can shame the sleeves on napkins, approach more than the arrival of trenchers. These were thick, stale slabs of bread used not only as edible plates, but also as occasionally edible napkins. They would soak up sauces, juices, and half-breathed regrets before being tossed to the dogs or the poor once suitably seasoned. A trencher's life was short, greasy, and deeply flavorful. Fast forward several courses in the Feast of Time, and we find the development of the ewer and basin ritual, a dramatic, near theatrical display that occurred before meals in noble homes. A servant would pour water over the hands of each guest so they might dine with some semblance of dignity and fewer traces of yesterday's pie. It wasn't long before ornamental cloths were offered with this gesture, resembling proto-napkins laced with lavender or rosewater to distract from other lingering, shall we say, medieval aromas. By the late 14th century, napery, that is, the art and inventory of household linens, had become almost as elaborate as the meals themselves. Certain households employed a napier, a position solely responsible for managing tablecloths, towels, and those early napkin-like fabrics. It was part linen curator, part hospitality enthusiast. One might imagine them solemnly arranging folds with the same intensity a knight sharpens his sword. And still, table manners trickled down at an uninspired pace. Even in later centuries, it was not uncommon for guests to bring their own cloth to meals. Personal napkins, like small flags of dining independence, were wrapped with cutlery or tucked into hats. It gave meals the air of a picnic crossed with a particularly genteel duel. Today, we barely notice our napkins. Whether paper or linen, starched or crumpled, they sit silently by our side, waiting to catch the butter or the berry, or the absurd hopes of eating pasta neatly. But they are descendants of an age of elbow stains and communal cloths, each fold whispering tales of greasy kings and sore-slicked jesters. And next time you attend a BBQ and see someone discreetly wipe their mouth on their sleeve, you might smile knowingly. No, they're not rude. They're historically grounded. Now, speaking of sleeves, bread, and other unconventional utensils, let's slowly journey into the curious history of edible serving ware. Yes, the original plate you can eat. Because in the Middle Ages, thriftiness came marinated in practicality. Back in the days of drawbridges and dubious hygiene, there was a curious custom that has, quite miraculously, crept into our modern lives without much explanation. Eating with our hands, but only sometimes. Picture a medieval banquet. Trumpets blaring, dogs loitering beneath the trestle tables, and nobles tearing into roast goose with the gusto of someone who has absolutely no concept of cholesterol. Yes, it was a handsy affair, but unlike the sloppy, sauce-drenched image we often conjure up, medieval finger food had its own sense of decorum. Sort of. You see, the upper crust of society, which, despite the name, rarely concerned themselves with actual bread crusts, those they left to the servants, often handled meals with an elegance that would surprise modern diners. For example, meats were cut into dainty bites at the table by professional carvers known as tranchers, whose entire social standing depended on how gracefully they could flay a pheasant. Diners then gingerly lifted the morsels between finger and thumb, as forks, while technically invented, were still considered a strange, possibly sinful affectation in many circles. To use a fork was, in some parts of Europe, akin to showing up to a funeral in feathers and tap shoes. One particularly dramatic 11th century account from the Byzantine Empire tells of a wealthy Venetian bride who scandalized the city by eating with fancy golden prongs. The church, sensing spiritual danger in cutlery, promptly declared her immoral. She also died of the plague not long after, which was casually chalked up as divine punishment for fork-based arrogance. Tough crowd. Yet despite this early forkophobia, a sort of proto-manners did develop. Guests were often expected to bring their own knives to dinner, not only to slice their food, but also as a subtle signal. I'm polite. I won't stab you unless severely provoked. Dining, much like dueling, was governed by etiquette. But now, let's zoom delicately into one delightfully odd detail. The trencher. No, not a grizzled war veteran from the trenches. Though both involve a bit of grit. In medieval dining, a trencher was a thick slab of day-old bread, sometimes toasted to sturdy perfection, and placed beneath your meal like a biodegradable plate made of carbs. Saucy stews, roasted meats, and oily vegetables would sit atop this homemade dish. gradually soaking in all the drippings. At the end of the meal, feasting guests had a choice: consume the sodden trencher as a kind of savoury dessert, or if that was too moist for one's mood, hand it off to the poor, the staff, or sometimes the dogs, who were less picky. Thus, the trencher straddled the line between dinnerware and dinner. Today, you may think of its spiritual descendant every time you order a soup in a bread bowl or encounter the rare joy of edible garnishes. The medieval notion of blending plate and palate has never fully gone away, just evolved into more Instagram-friendly formats. Now, lest you assume the cozy chaos of medieval meals was confined entirely to Europe, let's drift through the spice-laced air of the Silk Road, where global culinary cross-pollination was well underway. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and peppercorns weren't just used, they were worshipped. To sprinkle cinnamon on your stewed rabbit was to signal refinement and wealth, because that little heap of brown powder had travelled more than most people did in their entire lives. This spice obsession led to some interesting combinations. Imagine biting into a chicken leg lovingly dusted with sugar, almonds, and 3 kinds of pepper. It was sweet, savoury, slightly alarming, and entirely in vogue. The medieval palate didn't recognize the current Western divisions of sweet and savoury as sacrosanct. They mingled flavors like an enthusiastic hostess with no interpersonal boundaries. Have you met honey and vinegar? Oh, you simply must try them together. In our time, this brave flavor chaos lives on in dishes like chicken and waffles, or the mysterious phenomenon of pineapple on pizza. These aren't modern culinary inventions, they're echoes. Faint whispers of a time when seasoning was both style and status symbol, when taste buds were less cautious and more curious. And as the soft candlelight of this chapter flickers low, we find ourselves reclining alongside a well-fed friar, belly full of trencher soup and cinnamon rabbit, dreaming of forks not yet forgiven, and sauces as democracy incarnate, spreading across table and tongue with equal abandon. In the next gentle step of our journey, we'll meander into another strangely enduring delicacy, though whether it's food or presentation might still be a matter of polite debate. The medieval table, land of glistening trenchers, hands wiped on dogs, if you had one, and customs so peculiar they'd make a modern dinner party feel like a sterile operating theatre. But among the feasting quirks that tiptoed quietly through the centuries into our modern lives, there is one curiously tenacious creature we've invited into our homes without much thought at all. I speak not of gravy, nor of spoons, noble as they are, but of something far more mysterious. The tablecloth. Yes, the tablecloth. That innocent fabric shield gracing your dining table during special meals, or at least Thanksgiving, and which, if you're feeling particularly sophisticated, comes with matching napkins folded into bewildering origami swans. But once upon a medieval time, the tablecloth was less interior design and more moral compass. You see, the cloth was not merely there to protect furniture from goose fat stains or wild gestures with soup. No, it broadcasted a household's virtue. A clean, white linen cloth was a symbol of order, piety, and vaguely threatening cleanliness in uncertain times. In noble halls, great lengths of linen would be unfurled with a flourish, much as a red carpet, to proclaim not just the arrival of food, but of hospitality, status, and a strong preference for not seeing the wood grain beneath. Of course, in more modest dwellings, the idea of linen was theoretical at best. Instead, wooden boards were scrubbed clean, or at least scrubbed, and compared favourably to people who ate directly from their laps, their dogs, or whatever flattish surface was available. But as soon as someone could afford a cloth, even a tattered one dyed with hopeful herbs rather than wealth, they'd fling it across the table like a badge of honor. And alongside it came the napkin, a humble square of, well, usually whatever wasn't currently being a bed. But the practice of wiping one's mouth and fingers during a meal began to gain traction. Not, mind you, to eliminate mess. That would have required a miracle. But to display restraint. To show that you could eat meats with fatty drippings and still emerge without looking like you lost a duel with a goose. However, using the napkin was not a free-for-all. There were rules. Medieval manners books, yes, there were such things, written largely by monks with strong opinions and weak tableware, offered precise instructions. Wipe your knife before returning it to your belt. Do not lick your fingers excessively, unless you are abandoned in the forest. And do not, under any circumstances, blow your nose into the tablecloth. This one came up frequently, which suggests it was a bit of a problem. And if you think your Uncle Gerald is loud while chewing, consider that manners manuals suggested closing one's lips while eating, if possible. If possible, as though asking someone not to masticate like an agitated cow was an aspirational goal, not a bare minimum. Of course, all this cleanliness was relative. This was still a time when the Lord's salt cellar might well be triple the size of yours, and taking food from the middle of the dish was considered presumptive, unless you were the host or a very enthusiastic rogue. But even through grease and gruel, the idea of a properly laid table endured. The fascinating truth is, the ceremonial setup of the table persisted, not because of its practicality, but because it whispered of grace, like a sleeping knight in linen armor. Plates facing forward, just so. Bread to the left, trenchers set like edible shields. And although forks didn't join the European dining experience until scandalously late, being viewed as dangerously dainty and suspiciously Sienna, everything else about the table was designed to turn a chaotic act of survival into a quiet ritual of civility. These days, we may not think twice when we smooth out a cotton tablecloth for a meal, or toss on a plastic one with an ironic turkey print. But somewhere in those folds lies an echo of long halls, creaking benches, and candles flickering beside dripping goblets. So next time you set the table, whether with monogrammed linens or a picnic paper napkin carefully balanced on a knee, know that you are part of a lineage, a soft, billowing thread of history that stretches all the way from medieval manners to midnight snacks in fuzzy socks. And as we extinguish our candles and push back from the table of history, for just a moment, let us gently turn toward one final lingering morsel waiting beyond the feast. And so, at last, we arrive at the final flickering candle of our medieval banquet, a lingering morsel of history quietly nestled in our modern lives, hiding in plain sight like a monk in a hooded snuggie. Tonight's final oddity, the surprisingly durable legacy of trenchers. Once a flat hunk of stale bread. Yes, that's right, stale bread used as a plate. Back in the dusty, damp-socked days of the Middle Ages, plates weren't always the elegant porcelain discs we argue over at weddings. In fact, for common folk, or even nobles who liked to seem pious, plates could be made of week-old bread, thick enough to hold meat, gravy, vegetables, and at least one small prayer for digestion. These slabs were called trenchers, and they were often shared. One trencher between two people, which sounds cozy until you remember how rare forks were and how common coughs were. But still, there was a certain communal charm. Besides, who doesn't enjoy a dinner companion with a strong immune system? When the meal was done, the trencher, now soggy, gravy-stained, and vaguely shaped like France was not simply chucked into the bin. No, that would be wasteful. Instead, diners had several noble options. They might eat it. Yes, feast finale, bread plate à la stew. Or in many cases, they would donate it. Trenchers were collected and given to the poor, who surely looked forward to spending their evening nibbling on gravy sponge with a hint of someone else's conversation. And while you may think, well, certainly, that habit didn't survive, I invite you to consider the humble tradition of edible containers. The ice cream cone is essentially a sweet modern trencher. Taco bowls, trencher. Bread bowls filled with soup, chili, or a particularly bold mac and cheese. Entire mini-pubs made of carbs. All direct descendants of medieval diners who thought, maybe the plate should be the appetizer. Even the idea of using up every scrap, no waste, repurposed, echoes through today's foodie culture. Fashionable again, centuries later, is the notion that food is both meal and message. Whether it's sustainability, generosity, or simply the desire to eat a bowl made of sourdough. But let's not forget another odd yet enduring eating habit, the curious fear of dining alone. In the Middle Ages, eating was deeply communal, not just out of social desire, but out of necessity. Tables were often narrow, a single beam balanced on beer barrels, and seating arrangements resembled more a game of musical chairs than polite supper. People of all classes were crammed elbow to gravy-filled elbow. Eating alone was unusual, even suspicious. A solitary eater might well be branded a sorcerer, or worse, a picky noble. Today we doodle on phones to avoid seeming alone at brunch. Our ancestors simply invited more people to the plank, or shared a trencher. The desire to turn meals into moments of companionship stretches long across centuries, from candle-lit feasting halls to corner cafes. And then, of course, there is the ancient, enduring ritual of the after-dinner nap. Yes, even in medieval households, there existed the understandable impulse, after devouring one's portion of salted meat, hard cheese and wine, to quietly lean against the wall, cloak about the shoulders, and gently drift into dreams, much like you're doing now. As the fire in the hearth of history burns low, and the echoes of wooden spoons against pewter fade away, we begin to sense how close we remain to the whims and forks, or lack thereof, of long-forgotten villagers. That strange thing you do at dinner, the way you sop up sauce with bread, hold your spoon just so, eat slowly to prolong the experience, may well be a whisper from 1347. We think we invent traditions. More often, we simply forget who invented them first. So let the trenchers rest. Let the cookpots cool. Let the jester finally hang up his bells. You're not only full of curious facts now, you're wonderfully full of sleep. Drift along gently, dream-fed, through quiet castle halls and across endless countryside, where somewhere someone still dips bread into the bowl and thinks, now that is a plate worth eating. Good night, my dear wandering diner. You feasted well, sleep deep, and dream historically.